Thanks, guys, for joining us. Andrew, please introduce our speaker for the evening.
Okay. You were talking about the year 5750, which was 1990, and that was when Iraq was about to invade Kuwait, and the CIA was very involved in that. And I don't know if our speaker tonight was involved in that. He might share that with us today. But what I do know is that he has been my office mate and Ernie's office mate for the last 6 years plus, and he has a amazing reputation in the criminal defense community. He's represented some very high profile cases, and it's pretty interesting some of the people we see come through our office. So hopefully none of y'all never need to hire him, but he comes with a great recommendation. And without further ado, David Adler.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Ernie, as well, for inviting me here to join you all tonight. I don't have any prepared notes, and Andrew and Ernie gave sort of very flexible guidance as to what I should speak about. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about my criminal defense practice or criminal defense questions in general. No charge. I don't know how often you're going to be able to talk to a lawyer free of charge, but tonight's one of those times, thanks to Ernie and Andrew. And then, as I think they've told you, I did serve as a CIA officer for a number of years back in the early 90s. So I'm happy to answer questions you may have about the CIA or the intelligence community as well. Andrew mentioned the Iraq War. That is when I started. I actually started in June of 90, and the invasion, I think, took place in August of 90. So I was actually in headquarters as things were approaching the final ramp up to the invasion. I was not involved in any of the Iraqi what they called at the time the Iraqi task force in CIA, but several of my classmates were. And, we sat around the lunch table in the cafeteria talking about what was going on. I did wander one time into the basement of the building around July, if I remember correctly. And I don't think this is classified information in any way, but I remember there was a printing press firing off just thousands of sheets of Iraqi dinars that were going to be dumped into Iraq to cause hyperinflation. They were actually floated over in balloon operations, and then they would, small detonation dinars would float down to the ground. So suddenly the price of a Coca-Cola in Baghdad skyrocketed 10,000% just to cause more problems for Saddam Hussein and his co-conspirators. Anyhow, for those of you who don't know, the CIA is just one of about 18 American agencies that are involved in what we call the intelligence community. Obviously, the 4 branches of the military and the Coast Guard have intelligence operations. The Department of Energy is actually involved in the intelligence community as far as nuclear weapons. There are all sorts of other agencies. The National Geospatial Agency does a lot of satellite photography and things like that. So if you get a chance, you can Google the U.S. intelligence community. You might be surprised at just how many different agencies there are, and quite a few people are involved in the U.S. intelligence community. The other big one that a lot of people know about is the NSA, the National Security Agency. Despite what you might see in movies and on TV, NSA is strictly involved in sort of 2 areas. One is cryptology. They make the codes that keep American communications safe. And then they are also involved, obviously, in eavesdropping, and they have tremendous technical capabilities. They can literally dial into a cell phone in Moscow or Tokyo. Really an incredible agency. The CIA is the agency that I worked at. I was what's called an operations officer or a case officer. That is essentially the job that most people think of when they think of the CIA. I will tell you the CIA's probably got about 200 different job categories They have lawyers on staff, accountants, doctors, psychologists, obviously intelligence analysts, logistics people, fire safety people for the buildings. So it's quite a diverse group of job categories. The case officer job or operations officer is primarily responsible for recruiting, well, spotting and recruiting potential information sources, and then meeting securely with those information sources so that policymakers back in Washington, whether in the White House or Congress or senior levels of State Department, have as much information as they can about a situation that might impact the national security interests of the U.S. So I think people in the last maybe 20 years or so, there's been a pretty significant shift in how public the CIA has become. I may be the only former CIA officer who has not written a book. It seems to be very common nowadays. The older folks that were there when I joined would absolutely cringe when they saw that a former officer had written a book. They really felt that it was much better for operational success that we keep a low profile, as much as that was possible even back then, but it's even more difficult now. But the CIA is not a law enforcement agency. There are a lot of misconceptions about that as well. They're not interested in arresting people, and they really try to shy away from law enforcement activities. They leave that to the FBI, both domestically and internationally. The CIA is primarily, you could think of it as a sort of a newspaper, but for a very restricted readership. My job as a case officer was to spot, assess, recruit, and run human sources of information who had bosses in whatever organization they were in that didn't want us to have that information. So whether that organization was a foreign government or a foreign military or foreign corporation or a terrorist organization or other criminal organization, my job was to find those people that could provide information that Washington was looking for. We would get, depending on our area, we would get what were called requirements, areas that policymakers were interested in having more information on, sort of a shopping list for us. And then we would head out in whatever area of the world we were in and try to find people who could provide that information, which is really not an easy thing to do. You know, say, for example, if we're interested in a country, let's say France, just to pick an easy one. If we're interested in France's new surface-to-air missile, finding somebody who can give us information about that is not an easy thing to do. And so there are different techniques that we would use to sort of troll for those kind of people, maybe attend, in this case, some military hardware expositions or seminars, and keep our ears and eyes open for someone who might be positioned in either a corporation in France or a French agency that might be able to get us information on that particular requirement. Once we find that person, the next step, of course, is to figure out if they are, let's say, approachable, and in what way to best approach them. Obviously, if I march up to someone and say, hey, I'm a CIA officer, I'd like to talk to you about your job, conversation is going to be very short. And so that's where the CIA case officers use what are called cover positions. Sometimes, in years past, they were very well known as foreign service officers working as diplomats for the State Department. Sometimes they were civilian employees of the Pentagon or the Department of Defense. There's been a larger shift in recent years, and again, this is not classified, been a larger shift towards using what are called NOC situations. NOC stands for non-official cover. So those are officers who are posted abroad, men and women, who are under some sort of commercial cover. Some corporation has given permission to the CIA. Obviously, this happens at very senior levels of both corporate structure and the government. But some company gives permission to have a CIA officer placed in among their ranks. Let's say, again, I'll use France. I have nothing against the French, but it's just an easy example. You might be a IBM salesperson in Paris. You might be responsible for selling IBM computer equipment in Paris at an industrial or commercial level. The benefits of that kind of cover is you will probably meet a wider array of people. People who have strong counterintelligence training are going to stay away from any kind of U.S. government employee for fear that they're actually a CIA officer. Their radar is probably going to be a little less sensitive to someone who's got an office and a business card that says IBM on it. They're probably still likely to have received some training to be on guard. But certainly if I was to march up to someone and say I'm a State Department officer, it's going to shut off access to further meeting. A lot of times in training, we talked about how once you find that person and you chat them up, you want to get what we would call a second date. It's very similar in some ways to the dating world, if you all remember that or are involved in it now. But if I was to meet Ernie at a party and I thought that he might be someone that I wanted to check out, find out more about his access, if Ernie was to say to him, as we're standing around having cocktails, if he was to say, well, I'm looking forward to this weekend because I'm going fly fishing, this doesn't take any great rocket science. If I was to say to Ernie, you know, I've always been interested in that. I would love to try that. I've just never had time. Chances are Ernie's going to say to me, well, why don't you come this weekend? Or why don't we pick another time? And so what I've done there is not only have I gotten a second date with Ernie, but now I've moved the meeting from a cocktail party or a business party that might have 30, 40 people, 500 people. I've moved it to now where Ernie and I are off somewhere in a stream fishing, plenty of time to talk, get to know each other. No one else is around. I don't have to worry about the counterintelligence service from Ernie's home country watching us at the party and wondering what's going on. And so over time, I don't just stand there on the second date with Ernie and I fishing in the stream and say, hey, tell me all about that anti-surface-to-air missile you're working on. It's a very slow process. Intelligence agencies around the world have been burned by what are called double agents by moving a relationship too quickly. And frankly, I hate to say it, but the Soviets back in the days of the KGB, much as I disagreed with their political views, they were very effective at slowly cultivating relationships. They really would spend time, sometimes years and years, cultivating a relationship before they would be in a position to move that relationship to the next level where they would disclose, you know, I'm not just the IBM salesman here in France, or I'm not just the State Department consular officer here in Paris. And I appreciate all the things we've been talking about. You've really given me some great insight into your office and the political situation here in your country, but I feel like I have to be honest with you, and I am not just an IBM employee. Most of the times when you make that pitch, you should, if you're doing your job correctly, in my opinion, you will have an idea of what the answer is going to be already. It does happen where people are shocked, and I've heard war stories about agency officers pitching somebody and the person just rears up in horror and has absolutely no idea. But if you do it right and you slowly start moving the conversation over time, Ernie might at one point say, well, I'm not really supposed to talk about this, but blah, blah, blah. And then we get further into that kind of sensitive area where he knows he's not supposed to be giving that information to me, and yet he is giving that information to me. So when you make the pitch, obviously you got to have approval from headquarters to do so. They've been closely monitoring the development of the relationship through the officers, what are called cables or written reports back to Washington. And once the officer in the field feels it's appropriate, he will request permission to make the pitch. And if headquarters gives the okay, then you go out and you make that pitch. I was never turned down. I'm not the most successful case officer in history. It's just that I, like most CI officers, knew the likelihood was high that the person was going to accept. There's always that risk that you misread something. But if Ernie and I had gone fishing a couple of times and he either did not have the access to the information that I was looking for or did not prove a suitable candidate for further development, I would not just cut off contact with Ernie, because you never know what might happen down the road, but I would slowly back away and you know, maybe the next time he asks me to go fishing, I say I've got a little bit of work around the house this weekend, and slowly dial down the frequency of contact. But if you make the pitch and the person agrees, the reason you disclose it, I think most officers would tell you, is you want to move the relationship to an even more security conscious relationship, so that I tell Ernie, look, instead of us going fishing every week or us meeting at industry parties, I'm going to give you some basic tradecraft training, so that you can make sure you're not followed to the meetings that we have by your country's version of the FBI, and I can make sure I'm not followed, and we can meet securely and talk about some of the issues that you've been helping me with and helping the United States government understand the situation in your country and hopefully move things towards the better. And so once that happens, you know, the relationship has now progressed. Obviously, it's a covert intelligence relationship. Ernie is providing information to me. I go back after we meet and write up the reports, the information that Ernie has given me. You know, technically, I mean, I was proud of this. You write them up with as little bias as possible. You try to be as accurate as possible. There were opportunities to add what are called a field comment, where I could make it very plain that this was my impression of something, political development or military development. And then in response, Washington would send out that list of requirements again. Okay, thank you for that information from Ernie. Next time, ask him about, you know, the rocket propulsion system or the financing of a particular project or the placement of a particular device. And some of these relationships have gone on for decades. You can imagine in some countries, you know, undemocratic regimes, many people around the world for many decades have thought of the US as the best agent for positive change towards democracy. And so I personally encountered, and I heard many stories about third country nationals who were willing to risk everything to help their country by giving the United States as much information as possible. You have to remember, espionage is a crime in every single country on earth. Most places still have the death penalty for espionage. And so the person I recruited was putting everything literally on the line. Their life, their livelihood, their family safety in many cases, their career, their assets. And so, you know, people ask a lot about the motivation. Why would somebody do that? I wish I could say that political motivation was the driving force in most recruitments, but that's simply not true. It's mostly money. But there were instances where I would approach someone, let's say, hypothetically, and I would find out that they did have access to the information that I was looking for. And they happened to have, unfortunately, a brother who was very ill with cancer. And the country they live in was not sort of top-notch medical care. With headquarters approval, I could float out the idea, hey, you know, Ernie, I'm so sorry to hear about your brother. And I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but, you know, I have a good friend of mine, a college roommate, who's a great doctor at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. And I wouldn't mind reaching out to him and seeing if he could help your brother. That actually happens and has happened and probably still continuing to happen. And obviously that kind of relationship where you are literally involved in potentially saving a loved one's life really makes a very strong bond between the case officer and the person who has agreed to work with them. But again, many people, it's just a strictly financial arrangement. They're happy to sell their information to whoever. There have been some documented cases where not only is Ernie selling his information to me, but he's selling it to the Brits and to the Germans. And, you know, he meets with a different intelligence service every night of the week. And eventually, most of the time, if it's NATO allies, we find out about it. And sometimes they say something about it. Sometimes they just keep their mouth shut just to keep the information flow going. By the way, I didn't say it before, but if any of you have any questions about any of this stuff we're talking about, don't hesitate to jump in and ask.
David.
So that is largely the job of the case officer. That's about, I would say that's probably about 80% of the case officer's job, are developing those kind of relationships. Also taking over those kind of already established relationships when you move to a country for the start of a 2 or 3 year tour. Your predecessors have already recruited people. And so you're going to take over those relationships and continue the flow of intelligence. Some people are recruited to help in what are called covert action programs. They may own a safe house that we can use for secure meetings. You know, there are other types of logistical support that people have been recruited to provide, other than just actual reportable information. The other 20% of the case officer's job is involved in covert action programs. There's really been some bad publicity about these things over the years. Some of them have gone haywire. Many of them have been very successful. You know, one thing about CIA operations, or really intelligence operations in any country, is if they become a front page news story, no matter how successful they once were, they are now a failure. So the CIA is not really the kind of place you want to work if you need the pat on the back publicly, like my friends in the FBI or the DEA who like to pose when they've seized 1,000 kilos of cocaine. It's on the front page of the Chronicle. They're very proud of themselves, and rightfully so. CIA's work is not like that. You'll get some accolades in-house, but if it's on the evening news, it's by definition become a failure. The most recent covert action programs that you folks have probably been familiar with are some of the targeted killings of terrorist individuals in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, some other places. Before 9/11, many of you may not believe this, but before 9/11, the CIA had really not been very interested in assassination projects. They had discovered during the 50s and 60s they're very difficult to pull off. Oftentimes the blowback or the negative publicity is a big problem. 9/11 changed all of that. The technology of the drone also changed all of that. And so now it's become, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but it's become a very efficient system. Whereas it used to, the lag time between an officer in the field spotting a target and getting permissions up the chain of command through the White House, getting permission to fire, and going all the way back out to the person who's actually going to press the trigger, sometimes were 12 or 15 hours in the old days, and there was just no way to accomplish the goal. Now it's literally done in sometimes 4 or 5 minutes from the spotting of the target to the pulling of the trigger. So the CIA has taken a larger role in that in the past 20 or so years, obviously in coordination with the military. There's still some degree of bureaucratic infighting between who controls those kinds of assets, whether it's Pentagon or CIA. But obviously we've become very effective at that. And I think it's had a great positive impact on the war on terror. Most officers nowadays have rotated through at least one tour in Iraq or Afghanistan. At my time, which the agency was before 9/11, very few officers were carrying weapons. I was posted mostly in third world civil war situations, the Liberian Civil War, things like that. So I was issued some weapons. I think I had one classmate who was sent to the Philippines. Manila at that time had a pretty strong terrorist problem. But of my 60 or so classmates, nobody else was issued weapons. Obviously that's changed a lot now. The terrorist organizations that we're fighting nowadays have become much more adept at trying to spot CIA officers. It would be a tremendous coup for them to be able to capture or kill some CIA officers. One of the worst, you may have heard about the Jordanians. The agency works a lot with a variety of intel services around the world. Sometimes people are surprised to hear who our co-workers are, but we have a very good relationship with the Jordanians. They provided a doctor who claimed to have access to Osama bin Laden. They passed him off to the agency. And unfortunately, when he actually met with agency officers out in Afghanistan, he was, I think he was not even a double agent. I think he was actually a triple agent, but he was obviously wearing a suicide vest, and he killed a number of agency staff employees, a number of agency contract employees. And beyond the human toll, which of course is tragic, it's a tremendous PR victory for those kind of organizations to be able to pull that kind of stunt. So where I was, I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of these third world Civil War environments, but it's definitely not the James Bond situation where I had a tuxedo and a sports car and I was going to the casino every night. I was dealing with 11, 12-year-old boys who had 2 or 3 years combat experience, oftentimes high on drugs or some kind of bizarre alcohol drink, and very dangerous situations. But nonetheless, I still had requirements being sent out to me from Washington that I had to fulfill and sources that I had to try to recruit. The job was a little different. I didn't really have to worry about counterintelligence services. There were other things I had to worry about. Drug-crazed 12-year-olds present a different problem than a well-trained security service. But nonetheless, I was able to operate successfully. At the time, those places had 1-year tours, but I was able to somehow manage to survive, and they couldn't really find anyone who was willing to take my position, so I ended up staying a second year, and eventually finished up. No bullet holes, some in my car, but none in my clothing, thank God.
So maybe
First one says, wasn't the CIA created for a specific purpose, and was there not a sunshine date that was to be the end of the CIA? I read a lot of history books, and I seem to recall something like that. But the CIA was created officially back in 1947, and it was shortly thereafter made a permanent agency. So no, I don't believe there is a current sunset date for the CIA. I think that'd be probably, whether we agree with the CIA's activities in general or in a particular instance, I think that'd be a tough political sell right now to say that we need less security agencies than more. But second question, I do not believe there was a sunshine date on the cessation. How did I get into the CIA? Okay, great question. When I was in law school finishing up, I knew I wanted to serve the country before I went out on my legal career. So I looked into the Department of Justice, Department of Treasury. I was actually sitting at the main branch of the Houston Public Library downtown, flipping through a book of government agencies, and I saw the CIA. This is back in the days when people still went to libraries and there were still books. And I actually wrote a letter to the general counsel's office saying, I don't really know what you guys do, but I know you get in trouble a lot, and I think I'm going to be a good lawyer. I'm probably good at getting people out of trouble. So it must have been a slow day, but they responded, and they came and interviewed me about their Office of General Counsel. But about midway through the interview, they suggested that I might be interested in operations. I kind of chuckled because I thought it was James Bond. And they said, that's not really what actual intelligence operations are like. I'm sorry. They had asked me what my ideal job situation was. And I had said, I would like to spend part of my day in the office, part of my day in the library, and part of my day out in the field as a lawyer somehow. And they hit on that or keyed on that and said, that's really what a case officer does. You might be interested in that. So after that, there were a variety of questionnaires and examinations, medical exams, polygraph exams, security checks of my background. All told, it was probably about 6 months. But eventually I got a letter saying I'd been accepted. And it gave me a start date. It actually was my birthday in 1990 was my start date. And that was about it. They do recruit on college campuses. They do also issue what are called blind advertisements. So you may see an advertisement, probably not in a newspaper anymore, but in a magazine or an online magazine or publication that says, it's one of those ads that doesn't list the actual company name. It just says, looking for motivated individuals to work in overseas environments, please contact P.O. Box 12345, Chicago, Illinois. And then they'll eventually reveal to you that it's the CIA. It's a Hollywood creation that people end up working for the CIA and don't know that they're working for the CIA. That's not good for business. What happens to the end of the relationship? Are they just discarded? Sometimes yes, most of the time no, because sometimes that guy who has lost his access in the French Ministry of Defense comes back 3 years later to become the Assistant Minister of Defense. So we try to keep them online to some degree, but it's a much reduced contact frequency. Payments often stop. Andrew and Ernie asked me to tell a war story or two, so I'll tell you one about a individual who had been recruited by another officer who was in a terrorist organization, and the officer who went to a different officer was brought in to terminate the relationship, and because the general sentiment was the guy being terminated knew that his time had come up because his information well had sort of run dry. So the officer had a small pistol tucked between his legs as he was driving the car. He picked up the asset, the person had a small package in his hand. The recruited source had been told ahead of time that somebody else was going to be meeting him the following week, so he was not too surprised. But so when he got in the car and they're driving around, the officer gently terminates the relationship. I know that has negative or dramatic consequences, but it doesn't mean anyone's dying. It just means we're not going to be able to meet with you as much. But again, this guy was from a terrorist organization, so there was some safety concerns. So when the news was finally broken, the guy kind of, he kind of nodded his head like he knew this was coming. And he said, well, I got something for you. And he reached down into the package at his feet. And of course, the case officer went for the pistol. And the recruited source took out a box of chocolates and said, I just want you to give this to your predecessor. I've enjoyed meeting with him, but obviously came that close to really terminating that relationship. Yeah, I know the movies in Hollywood like to portray oftentimes the CIA officers as cold-hearted thugs and abandoning people, throwing them under the bus. But I can tell you, I heard many, many stories from my instructors and senior officers who were active during the Cold War about how agency officers not only risked their lives to save sources, say an East German source who had been discovered and had to be exfiltrated out of East Germany. Not only did the agency officers risk their lives, but I'm not sure if I should be proud of this or not, but I think I am. They did so against agency instructions. Like higher ups in Washington said, no, we're not going to risk the potential fallout if you get caught doing this. And, some of these agency officers had been working with some of these people for 3, 4, 5 or more years. And we're not just going to throw them under the bus and let the Stasi or the East German intelligence service, capture these people and potentially execute them. Not every relationship is like that. I certainly recruited people that I didn't think much of, but I had to put a smile on my face and tell them how appreciative I was of their work. But yeah, the agency, they're dedicated Americans. They believe in what they're doing. It's a very difficult job. It's not for everybody. It doesn't pay the greatest. But I still bristle at some of the portrayals of agency officers and agency projects that I see occasionally in the movies and on TV. Certainly the agency's made mistakes, no doubt about that. But by and large, they're doing a very difficult job under very difficult circumstances. How exaggerated was Homeland? I've never actually seen that show. I'm sorry. I don't really watch CIA movies. My dad and I went to see one, and I just sat there grumbling, saying, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not true. And he said, you know what? I'm never going to one of these movies with you again. So I really don't know how exaggerated Homeland was because I've never seen it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not aware. I'm not aware of a single agency officer having a problem inside the U.S. Overseas is a different story. I probably would not, much as I would like to go see Havana, Cuba someday, I'm probably going to steer clear of that just because my name might be in a database somewhere down there, and I want to make sure I can catch my return flight. But I've traveled many times since I've left the agency and since my name has been publicly associated as a former agency officer, and never had any problems, never had any security concerns. And
are there different levels of agencies within the CIA?
No. I guess it's an individual decision how concerned you are. I take my safety and my family safety very seriously. But the likelihood that someone that I dealt with would make the effort to find me and come out and do something, I'm more worried about random crime in an urban environment, whether it's in the US or overseas, than I am about an agency associated problem. Keep in mind, in the old days too, and it's probably still true to some degree with the SVR or whatever the Russians are now, there was sort of this tacit understanding that, you know, we might mess with each other's operations, but we're not going to physically harm each other's officers. That was very rare, that much as we may have hated the Soviets and they hated us, there was not a lot of violence. I think one of the worst things they did was when you can Google this, they used something called magic dust or spy dust, where they were sprinkling suspected agency officers in Moscow with a radioactive dust so that they could be followed, you know, with a Geiger counter basically. And, you know, once we found out about it, you know, the threat was basically, if you're sprinkling us with radioactive dust, you can imagine what we're going to sprinkle your folks with in Washington. So cut that shit out. Pardon my language. But there really wasn't a lot of violence. You know, that, of course, is very different, very, very different from the terrorists, the counterterrorism world. That's a whole different ballgame. And obviously there, violence is the name of the game. But among competing, even hostile intelligence services, there really was very, very little violence. So I've not had any security concerns about leaving the agency. I was given the option when I left. I believe it was the first time they started doing this when I left. I could either have left covert, which is they would have given me a fake title to, you know, if I apply for a mortgage and they say, well, where have you worked the last 5 years? I'd have to, you know, say U.S. Department of State or IBM or something. Or I could leave overt, where if somebody called up the agency to verify my employment, they would say, yes, he worked here as an officer. And I chose overt. Frankly, I chose overt just because I didn't want to deal with the potential government bureaucratic madness of somebody missing, you know, oh, we forgot to add his name to the list. So when the mortgage company calls to verify, they say, no, we never heard of him. So I've had people check with the agency, and sure enough, they will tell you, yes, I work there. I don't think they'll tell you what I did. They might tell you the years I worked there. They probably won't tell you the locations I worked, but I've never had a problem. And besides, if the shit hits the fan, hopefully they'll hit Ernie and Andrew in the office before they get to me.
David,
are you aware of any operatives who were in, let's call it Southern Angola in the late 70s or early 80s?
Yeah, Ernie or Andrew had told me that a number of you guys had some experiences down there, or contacts with some people who had experiences down there. And I remember 2 instructors, pretty wild characters, quite frankly, who were involved in the Angolan situation, Mozambique a little bit. It was some pretty hairy times. And I remember, you know, this was before I got assigned to my own little third world hell. I remember laughing at their stories, thinking they were hilarious. And then, of course, I found myself in the middle of the exact same thing 20 years later. It wasn't so funny. But I don't remember their names. There was one guy, I believe, in Zaire, and he's been on TV. He was very badly burned in a plane crash, an agency plane crash. And you can look him up online. He's given a couple of documentary interviews. Really brave officer, but suffered terrible burns in a plane crash of an agency. I believe it was an agency aircraft. But that was Zaire. That wasn't Angola or Mozambique. I was pretty much in Western and Eastern Africa. I did not go to Southern Africa for work. Yeah, those were some, you know, obviously those kind of places, most Westerners don't understand what it's like in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Mozambique, or Angola when there really is just total chaos. I mean, it's really just, you know, roving bands of well-armed teenagers. It's an experience. So.
Thanks, David. Interesting experience you've had.
I do have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you miss the CIA life?
Do I miss the CIA life? That's a great question. So I miss the work, to be honest. I like the work quite a bit, even though I was in some very violent places. I did enjoy the work. I know that sounds twisted and probably does not speak well of my mental health, but I miss the work. What I don't miss, and the reason I left, was the bureaucracy. You know, some people can do very well in a federal government agency or a school district or, you know, some kind of public entity or large corporation. It's not my cup of tea. I'm much better suited for solo activity, and I think that's why I enjoyed the CIA stations that I worked at were largely 1- and 2-man posts, compared to Paris is probably a 500-person operation. So I chose to go to Africa specifically because the offices were small and I thought the bureaucracy would be pretty tiny. And I was correct. What I forgot about is the bureaucracy that you deal with on the other side of the ocean. The Washington people just have a kind of strange attitude and didn't always understand the realities on the ground when they came up with some of the ideas that they presented to me. So I miss the work. I don't miss the bureaucratic environment.
Okay, again, David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ba'olam